Thinner by Richard Bachman. Thinner. The old gypsy man with the rotting nose whispers to William Halleck as Halleck and his wife Heidi come out of the courthouse. Just that one word. And before Halleck can jerk away, the old gypsy reaches out and caresses his cheek with one twisted finger, his lips spread open like a wound, showing a few tombstone stumps poking out of his gums. They are black and green. His tongue squirms between them and then slides out to slick his grinning, bitter lips. Thinner. This memory came back to Billy Halleck fittingly enough as he stood on the scales at 7 in the morning with a towel wrapped around his middle. He had to crane forward slightly to read the numbers on the scale, too big, as Dr. Houston delighted in telling him. "Billy," from downstairs. "Coming." He went downstairs. Linda, his 14-year-old daughter, was just going out the door in a flirt of a skirt and a flip of her ponytail. "Bye, Dad. Have a good day, Lynn." He sat down at the table, grabbed the Wall Street Journal. "Lover," Heidi said. She put breakfast in front of him, a steaming mound of scrambled eggs, an English muffin with raisins, 5 strips of crisp country-style bacon, good eats. Thinner, the old man had said, and what the hell was it with his nose? Syphilis, cancer, or something even more terrible like leprosy? And by the way, why can't you just quit it? Why can't you just let it alone? "You can't get it off your mind, can you?" Heidi said suddenly, so suddenly that Halleck started in his seat. "Billy, it was not your fault. The judge said so." Not his fault, right? The judge had said so. Judge Rossington, Carey to his friends. Yes. Good old Carey Rossington, before whom Billy had argued more than a dozen municipal cases. Good old Carey Rossington, with whom Billy sometimes played poker down at the club. Good old Carey Rossington, who hadn't disqualified himself when his good old golfing and poker buddy, Billy Halleck, came before him in court. Not to argue some point of municipal law, but on a charge of vehicular manslaughter. "Not hurting my appetite any," he said, and that was certainly true. Angst or no angst, he had lain waste to the scrambled eggs, and of the bacon there was now no sign. He reached across the table and took her hand. "Heidi, it's all right, and even if it's not, it's all over." "I know it is. I know." In the city, a damaged suit that had dragged on for over 3 years, a suit he had expected to drag on in one shape or another for the next 3 or 4 years, came to an unexpected and gratifying end at mid-morning, with the plaintiff agreeing during a court recess to settle for an amount that was nothing short of stupefying. Billy called Heidi at home. "Mohawk," he said when she picked up the phone. It was a rambling upstate New York resort where they had spent their honeymoon, a gift from Heidi's parents a long, long time ago. Both of them had fallen in love with the place, and they had spent 2 vacations there since. "What?" "Mohawk," he repeated. "If you don't want to go, I'll ask Jillian from the office." "No, you won't. Billy, what is this?" "Canley is going to settle. In fact, Canley has settled, and I'm on top of the world." "Billy, God!" she squealed again, this time so loud the phone distorted. Billy held it away from his ear, grinning. "How much is your guy getting?" Billy named the figure, and this time he had to hold the phone away from his ear for almost 5 seconds. On the way home, he found himself thinking about Ginelli and the 3 brothers, the restaurant in which Richard Ginelli had an interest. It was Ginelli you thought of first. When you got home that day and Heidi was sitting out in the kitchen crying, it was Ginelli you thought of first. "Hey, Rich, I killed an old lady today. Can I come into town and talk to you?" But Heidi was in the next room, and Heidi would not have understood. Billy's hand hovered over the telephone and then fell away. It occurred to him with sudden clarity that he was a well-to-do lawyer from Connecticut who, when things got hairy, could think only of one person to call, a New York hoodlum. Billy had met him through the firm, which had done some legal work for Ginelli 7 years ago, incorporation work. Billy, then a very junior lawyer with the firm, had been given the assignment. None of the senior partners would have touched it. Even then, Richard Ginelli's reputation had been very bad. Billy had begun this 3 months' work expecting to dislike and perhaps fear the man he was working for. Instead, he found himself drawn to him. Ginelli was charismatic, fun to be around. More, he treated Billy himself with a dignity and respect which Billy would not find in his own firm for another 4 years. All of his work for Ginelli had been completed long before a New York grand jury had indicted the man for ordering a wave of gangland-styled executions in the wake of a drug war. The indictments had come down from a New York Superior Court in the fall of 1980. They were buried in the spring of 1981, due mostly to a 50% mortality rate among the state's witnesses. The others decided, not so surprisingly, that they could no longer be sure it was Richie the Hammer Ginelli they had overheard giving the orders to kill a Brooklyn dope baron named Brikovsky. He and Ginelli had exchanged Christmas cards over the years and had gotten together for the occasional meal, usually at the Brothers. Following what Ginelli stolidly referred to as my legal problems, the meals ceased. "You better stop coming around for a while," he had told Billy. "What? Why?" Billy had asked. "Because as far as the world is concerned, I'm a gangster," Ginelli had replied. "Young lawyers who associate with gangsters do not get ahead, William, and that's what it's really all about, keeping your nose clean and getting ahead." "That's what it's all about, huh?" Even so, he had kept in touch and had dropped in from time to time. Although he admitted to himself as he swung up the Fairview exit ramp, the intervals had grown longer and longer, and when he had found himself faced with what might be a charge of negligent vehicular manslaughter, it had been Ginelli he thought of first. "But good old Carrie Rossington took care of that," his mind whispered. "So why are you thinking about Ginelli now? Mohonk, that's what you ought to be thinking of." It was their third night at Mohonk, and they had just finished making love. It was the 6th time in 3 days, a giddy change from their usual sedate twice-a-week pace. Billy lay beside her, liking the feel of her heat, liking the smell of her perfume. For a moment the thought made a hideous cross-connection, and he was seeing the gypsy woman in the moment before the old struck her. Then the vision was gone. He rolled toward his wife and hugged her tight. She hugged him back one-armed and slipped her free hand up his thigh. "You know," she said, "you really have lost weight." "Huh?" "Billy Halleck, you're skinnier." He slapped his belly, which he sometimes called the house that Budweiser built, and laughed. "Ha, not much. I still look like the world's only 7 months pregnant man." "You're still big, but not as big as you were." "I know. I can tell. Now, when did you weigh yourself last?" He cast his mind back. It had been the morning Canley had settled. He had been down to 246. "I told you I'd lost 3 pounds, remember?" "Well, you weigh yourself again first thing in the morning," she said. "No scales in the bathroom," Halleck said comfortably. "You're kidding." "Nope. Mohonk's a civilized place." "We'll find one." Soon enough they slept. And in his dream he and Heidi were coming back from the shop and save. Only he knew it was a dream this time. He knew what was going to happen, and he wanted to tell her to stop what she was doing, that he had to concentrate all his attention on his driving, because pretty soon an old gypsy woman was going to dart out from between 2 parked cars, from between a yellow Subaru and a dark green Firebird. But he couldn't speak. The pleasure woke again at the touch of her fingers, playful at first, then more serious. The pleasure mixed uneasily with a feeling of terrible inevitability. Now he saw the yellow Subaru ahead, parked behind the green Firebird with the racing stripe. He tried to scream, "Quit it, Heidi! It's her! I'm going to kill her again if you don't quit it! Please, God, no! Please, God, Christ, no!" But the figure stepped out between the 2 cars. Halleck was trying to get his foot off the gas pedal and put it on the brake, but it seemed to be stuck right where it was, held down with a dreadful, irrevocable firmness. Then, thud! Thud! One hand flailing limply up above the old's hood, heavily wrinkled, dressed in pagan rings of beaten metal. 3 drops of blood splattered the windshield. Halleck was vaguely aware that Heidi's hand had clenched agonizingly on his erection, retaining the orgasm that shock had brought on, creating a sudden, dreadful pleasure-pain. The new day was bright and clear, and Halleck agreed to climb the labyrinth trail with his wife, if they could go down to New Paltz first so he could buy some sneakers. In town, Halleck found that sneakers had become déclassé. No one would even admit to remembering the word. He bought a pair of dandy green and silver Nike walking and climbing shoes and was quietly delighted at how good they felt on his feet. Outside the shoe store was a penny-weighing machine, one of those that advertises your weight and fate. Halleck hadn't seen one since he was a kid. "Hop up, hero," Heidi said. "I've got a penny." "Heidi, those things don't weigh true, you know that." "A ballpark figure's all I want. Come on, Billy, don't be a poop." He gave her the package containing his new shoes and stepped up on the scale. She put a penny in. There was a clunk, and then 2 curved silvery metal panels drew back. Behind the top one was his weight, behind the lower one the machine's idea of his fate. Halleck drew in a harsh, surprised breath. I knew it, Heidi was saying beside him. I knew you were thinner. If she had heard his own harsh gasp, Halleck thought later, she no doubt thought it was because of the number at which the scale had redlined. Even with all his clothes on, and his Swiss Army knife in the pocket of his corduroy pants, even with a hearty mohunk breakfast in his belly, that line was centered neatly at 232. He had lost 14 pounds since the day Canley had settled out of court. But it wasn't his weight that made him gasp. It was his fate. The lower panel had not slid aside to reveal financial matters will soon improve, or old friends will visit, or do not make important decision hastily. It had revealed a single black word: thinner. They rode back to Fairview mostly in silence, Heidi driving until they were within 15 miles of New York City and the traffic got heavy. Then she pulled into a service plaza and let Billy take them the rest of the way home. No reason why he should not be driving. The old woman had been milled, true enough. One arm almost torn from her body, her pelvis pulverized, her skull shattered like a Ming vase hurled onto a marble floor. But Billy Halleck had not lost a single point from his Connecticut driver's license. Good old Carrie Rossington had seen to that. "Did you hear me, Billy?" He glanced at her for only a second, then returned his eyes to the road. "I was wool gathering, sorry. I just said thank you for a wonderful time." She smiled at him and touched his arm briefly. "You're welcome," he said. "You're always welcome, babe. And when we get home..." "I'll jump on your bones again," he cried. "You can jump me if you want to," Heidi said, "but what I really want is for you to jump on our bathroom scales." "Come on, Heidi, I lost some weight, no big deal." "I'm very proud of you for losing some weight, Billy, but we've been together almost constantly for the last 5 days, and I'll be darned if I know how you're losing it." "Why gild the lily?" he asked, slowing down to slam 40 cents into the basket of the Rye toll booth. "What you mean is I'm a great big hog. Say it right out if you want, Heidi. I can take it." "I didn't mean anything like that," she cried, "but I love you and I'm going to say what I have to say. When people start to lose weight, even though they're not on a diet, it can mean they're sick. It's one of the 7 warning signs of cancer." Well, the word was out. Cancer. God knew the word had bobbed up in his own mind more than once since getting on the penny scale in front of the shoe store. It had bobbed up like some evil clown's dirty balloon, and he had turned away from it. "I felt fine." "I'm sure you felt fine," she said, "and that's great. But a checkup would be great, too. You haven't had one in over 18 months, and I bet Dr. Houston misses you." "I am not sick." "Then just humor me." They rode the rest of the way to Fairview in silence. Halleck wanted to pull her to him and tell her sure, okay, he would do what she wanted, except a thought had come to him, an utterly absurd thought. Absurd, but nevertheless chilling. "Maybe there's a new style in old gypsy curses, friends and neighbors. How about that possibility? They used to change you into a werewolf or send a demon to pull off your head in the middle of the night, something like that, but everything changes, doesn't it? What if that old man touched me and gave me cancer?" She's right. It's one of the tattletales. Losing 20 pounds just like that is like when a miner's canary drops dead in his cage. Lung cancer, leukemia, melanoma. Linda greeted them with extravagant kisses and, to their mutual amazement, produced a very creditable lasagna from the oven. As she rushed out, she kissed her father's cheek loudly and cried, "Bye, Skinny." Halleck watched her mount her bike and pedal down the front walk, ponytail flying, and then turned to Heidi. He was dumbfounded. "You told her. You called ahead and told her to say that. Female conspiracy." "No." He scanned her face and then nodded tiredly. "No, I guess not." Heidi nagged him upstairs, where he finally ended up on the scales in the bathroom, naked except for a towel around his waist. The digital readout said 229. "That settles it," Heidi said flatly. "I'm making you an appointment with Dr. Houston." "I'll make it myself," he said. "When?" "Wednesday. I'll make it Wednesday. Houston goes out to the country club every Wednesday afternoon and plays 9 holes. I'll speak to him in person." "Why don't you call him tonight, right now?" "Heidi," he said, "no more." And something in his face must have convinced her not to push it any further. 3 days later, his weight was 221 pounds, and he was more frightened than he had ever been in his life. Billy Halleck remembered how they had seen the gypsies for the first time the day they had come to Fairview. They had parked along one side of the Fairview town common, and a flock of their kids had run out onto the greensward to play. The gypsy women stood gossiping and watching them. They looked bright, alive, somehow dangerous. A young man jumped out of a VW microbus and began to juggle oversized bowling pins. Fairview children ran toward him as if drawn by a magnet, yelling excitedly. Muscles rippled under the young man's shirt, and a giant crucifix bounded up and down on his chest. Fairview mothers gathered some of the kids up and bore them away. Other mothers were not so fast. Billy, Heidi, and Linda Halleck had been there that day, 2 days before Halleck would strike and kill the old gypsy woman less than a quarter of a mile from here. They had been having a picnic lunch and waiting for the first band concert of the spring to begin. Most of the others abroad on the common that day had been there for the same reason, a fact the gypsies undoubtedly knew. "Linda, stay here," Heidi said sharply. "Why, Mom? It's a carnival. At least I think it is." "They're gypsies," Heidi said. "Keep your distance. They're all crooks." The young man tossed his bowling pins back into the open side of the door of the microbus one by one, and a smiling, dark-haired girl whose beauty was almost ethereal tossed him 5 Indian clubs, one after another. The young man now began to juggle these, grinning, sometimes tossing one up under his arm and yelling, "Hoi!" each time he did it. An elderly man wearing Oshkosh bib overalls and a checked shirt began handing out flyers. The young woman now jumped lightly down from the van's doorway with an easel. She set it up and propped a bull's-eye target on the easel. Someone from inside the van tossed her a slingshot. The girl stepped away from the target on the easel, produced some ball bearings from her breast pocket, and shot 3 quick bullseyes, plop, plop, plop. Soon she was surrounded by boys and a few girls, clamoring for a turn. A Fairview police car arrived soon enough, and 2 cops stepped out. One was Hopley, the chief of police, a roughly handsome man of about 40. Hopley began discussing the facts of life with the gypsy who had been doing the juggling act and the older gypsy in the Oshkosh overalls. Oshkosh said something. Hopley shook his head. Then the juggler said something and began to gesticulate. "What's happening, Mom?" Linda asked, frankly fascinated. "Nothing, dear," Heidi said. Suddenly she was busy wrapping things. "Are you done eating?" "Yes, please. Daddy, what's going on?" "Not much," he said. "A little difference of opinion." Hopley said something to the other cop, and the patrolman produced a notebook from his hip pocket. He strolled to the nearest car, a converted Cadillac hearse of early 60s vintage. He began writing it up. He did this with great ostentation. When he had finished, he moved on to the VW microbus. Oshkosh approached Hopley and began to speak urgently. Hopley shrugged and looked away. The patrolman moved on to an old Ford sedan. Juggler abruptly turned and went back to the microbus, simply allowing his remaining Indian clubs to drop onto the grass. The microbus had been parked behind the pickup with the woman and the unicorn painted on the homemade camper cap. Oshkosh bent to retrieve them, speaking anxiously to Hopley as he did so. The young woman tried to speak to Juggler, but he brushed by her and stepped into the microbus. She stood for a moment looking at Oshkosh, whose arms were full of Indian clubs, and then she also went into the bus. The gypsy women were shooing their children back to the caravan. Oshkosh approached Hopley again and said something. Hopley shook his head with finality, and that was it. Oshkosh went back to his own car, which was at the head of the line. As its motor roared into life, all the other motors did likewise. Most were loud and choppy. Halleck heard a lot of missing pistons and saw a lot of blue exhaust. Oshkosh's station wagon pulled out, bellowing and farting. The others fell into line, heedless of the local traffic. Dr. Houston saw him 2 days later. Halleck sat down in the den-like room, pictures of clipper ships on the walls, deep leather chairs, deep-piled gray rug, where Houston did his consulting. His heart was hammering hard, and he felt droplets of cold sweat nestled at each temple. "Everything looks fine," Houston said mildly. Halleck blinked. The fear had by now rooted deep enough so that he was positive he had misheard Houston. "What?" "Everything looks fine," Houston repeated. "We can do some more tests if you want, Billy, but I don't see the point right now. Your blood looks better than it has at your last 2 physicals. As a matter of fact, your cholesterol is down, same with the triglycerides. You've lost some more weight. The nurse got you at 217 this morning, but what can I say? You're still almost 30 pounds over your optimum weight, and I don't want you to lose sight of that," but he grinned. "I'd sure like to know your secret." "I don't have one," Halleck said. He felt both confused and tremendously relieved, the way he had felt on a couple of occasions in college when he had passed tests for which he was unprepared. It's a great relief, he confessed. I was scared, I was already dealing with the big C, trying to. Well, you may have to, Houston said, but not this year. So why am I losing weight? Halleck asked. Do you know? Nope. Houston seemed pleased by the fact. But my guess is that you may actually be thinking yourself thin. It can be done, We see it fairly often. Okay, Halleck said. He was willing to be convinced. Houston got up to see him out. If you continue to lose weight, we'll run an entire metabolic series on you, he said. Sometimes they can show us a lot. Anyway, I doubt if we'll have to go to that. My guess is your weight loss will start to taper off, 5 pounds this week, 3 next week, 1 the week after that. Then you're going to get on the scales and see that you've put on a pound or 2. You've eased my mind a lot, Halleck said, and gripped Houston's hand hard. Houston smiled complacently. That's what we're here for, Billy boy. Billy boy went home to his wife. He said you're okay? Halleck nodded. She put her arms around him and hugged him hard. He could feel the tempting swell of her breasts against his chest. Want to go upstairs? She looked at him, her eyes dancing. My, you are okay, aren't you? You bet. They went upstairs and had magnificent sex. The morning following, the bathroom scales showed him at 2:15, and Halleck felt hopeful. Only 2 pounds. The process was slowing down. He went downstairs whistling and ate 3 fried eggs and half a dozen link sausages. His mind at rest, Halleck neither weighed himself nor thought much about the matter for another 4 days, and then an embarrassing thing very nearly happened to him in court and in front of Judge Hilmer Boynton. Halleck stood to make an objection, and his pants started to fall down. He got halfway up, felt them sliding relentlessly down his hips and buttocks, and he sat down very quickly. He felt a blush mount into his cheeks. Is it an objection, Mr. Halleck, or a gas attack? The spectators, mercifully few of them, tittered. Nothing, Your Honor, Halleck muttered. I changed my mind. The judge called a recess 10 minutes later. Halleck sat at the defense table pretending to pore over a sheaf of papers. When the hearing room was almost empty, he rose, hands stuffed into his suit coat pockets in a gesture he hoped looked casual. He was actually holding his trousers up through his pockets. He took off the suit coat in the privacy of the men's room stall, hung it up, looked at his pants, and then took off his belt. His pants, still buttoned and zipped, slithered down to his ankles. His change made a muffled jingle as his pockets struck the tile. He sat down on the toilet, held the belt up like a scroll, looked at it, and felt his heart speeding up to a frightened run. The deepest indentation in the belt was just beyond the first hole. It had been quite comfortable for a long while. Now there were other indents in the belt beyond the second hole, and the fourth, and the fifth, finally the sixth and last. His belt told a truer, briefer story than Michael Houston had done. The weight loss was still going on, and it wasn't slowing down, it was speeding up. He had gotten to the last hole in the belt. Now he needed a 7th hole, which he didn't have. He stood on the scales that night after Heidi and Linda were both asleep, looking down, not believing. He looked for a long time. 195. The next day he went out and bought clothes. He bought them feverishly, as if new clothes that fit him well, would solve everything. He went to work and came home. He drank too much, ate second helpings that he didn't want, and which sat heavily in his stomach. A week passed, and the new clothes did not look trim and neat any more. They had begun to bag. He approached the bathroom scales, his heart thudding so heavily that it made his eyes throb and his head ache. He would discover later that he had bitten his lower lip hard enough to make it bleed. With a kind of lunge, he got onto the scale. 188. Halleck turned off the bathroom light and went downstairs. Heidi was sitting at his desk. When she turned to him, Billy saw such woe in her eyes that he was almost physically staggered. Yeah, I'm still losing weight, he said. How much? The scales upstairs say I'm down to 188. Oh, Christ! He nodded toward her cigarettes. Can I have one of those? Yes, if you want one. Billy, you're not to say a word to Linda about this, not one. Don't have to, he said, lighting up. She knows. I've seen it in her face. I just didn't know what I was seeing until tonight. You've got to go back to see Houston, she said. The metabolic series. Heidi listened to me, he said, then stopped. What? She asked. What, Billy? For a moment he almost told her everything. Something stopped him, and he was never sure later what it was, except that for one moment, sitting there on the edge of his desk and facing her with their daughter watching TV in the other room and one of her cigarettes in his hand, he felt a sudden, savage moment of hate for her. The memory of what had happened, what had been happening in the minute or so before the old gypsy woman darted out into the traffic, returned to him in a flash of total recall. Heidi had scooted over next to him and had put her left arm around his shoulders, and then, almost before he was aware it had happened, she had unzipped his fly. He felt her fingers, light and oh so educated, slip through the gap and then through the opening of his shorts. What had possessed her? She had never done such a thing before, and Halleck would have sworn that such a thing had never crossed her mind. But she had done it, and the old gypsy woman had darted. The fact was that Heidi's unexpected move had excited him tremendously, probably because it had been unexpected. The fact was that about 85% of his attention had been diverted from his driving. The fact was that if Heidi hadn't picked that particular day to try out a little autoeroticism, Halleck would have been on top of his job and his responsibility as the operator of a motor vehicle, and the Olds would have stopped at least 5 feet short of the old gypsy woman. Stopped with a screech of brakes that would have caused the mothers wheeling their babies across the common to look up quickly. Things would have been all right. There would have been no hearing, and no old rotten-nosed gypsy waiting outside to caress Halleck's cheek and whisper his dreadful one-word curse. All of this could be traced directly back to Heidi. It had been her fault, all of it. Yes, it had been her fault. But the old gypsy hadn't known that. And so Halleck had received the curse, and Halleck had now lost a grand total of 61 pounds, and there she sat. And there were brown circles under her eyes, and her skin looked too sallow, but those brown circles weren't going to kill her, were they? So the moment when he might have confessed his fears to her, when he might have said simply, "I believe I'm losing weight because I have been cursed," that moment passed. "I'll go back and see Mike Houston again," he said. "Tell him to go ahead and book the metabolic series." "Oh, Billy," she said, and held her arms out to him. He went into them, and because there was comfort there, he felt shame for his bright hate of only moments ago. But in the days which followed, the hate recurred more and more often, in spite of all he could do to stop it or hold it back. His appointment was for May 12th, a week away. During the days between, he watched himself continue to erode, and he strove to contain the panic that nibbled slowly away at his resolve to play the man. "Daddy, you're losing too much weight," Linda said uneasily at dinner one night. "If it's a diet, I think it's time you quit it." "Does it look like I'm dieting?" Halleck said, pointing at his plate with his fork, which dripped gravy. He spoke mildly enough, but Linda's face began to work, and a moment later she fled from the table, sobbing, her napkin pressed to her face. Halleck looked bleakly at his wife, who looked bleakly back at him. "I'll talk to her," he said, starting to get up. "If you go see her looking like you do right now, you'll scare her to death," Heidi said, and he felt that surge of bright metallic hate again. 186, 183, 181, 180. It was as if someone, the old gypsy with the rotting nose, for instance, was using some crazy supernatural eraser on him, rubbing him out, pound by pound. 2 nights before he was scheduled to check into Glassman Clinic, Billy stood on the scales looking dismally down at the dial, 179 tonight. And as he stood looking down at the dial, it occurred to him that the person he really ought to talk to about these crazy fears was Judge Carrie Rossington. He dressed quickly, went downstairs, and pulled a light jacket out of the closet. "Where are you going?" Heidi asked, coming out of the kitchen. "Out," Halleck said. "I'll be back early." Lida Rossington opened the door and looked at Halleck as if she had never seen him before. Her gaze made him acutely uncomfortable. "Lida? It's Bill Halleck." "Of course it is. Hello, Billy." "Lida, is Carrie—" "Carrie's not here, Billy. He's—" She stopped. He made a gesture for her to go on. "He's been called back to Minnesota. His sister is very ill." "That's interesting," Halleck said, "since Carrie doesn't have any sisters." He saw the bright track of a single tear running from her right eye almost to the corner of her mouth. "Go away," she said. "Just go away, Billy, all right? Don't ask questions. I don't want to answer them." "Look at me, Lita," he said. "I've lost 70 pounds. Do you hear me? 70 pounds. "That doesn't have anything to do with me," she cried in a low, harsh voice. Her complexion had gone a sick clay color. Spots of rouge stood out on her face like the spots of color on a clown's cheeks. Her eyes looked raw. Her lips had drawn back from her perfectly capped teeth in a terrorized snarl. "No, but I need to talk to Carrie," Halleck persisted. "Please tell me where he is, Lita. Is he here?" Her reply was a question, and for a moment he couldn't breathe at all. Was it the gypsies, Billy? Now that it was here, a chance to actually say it out loud, he found he had to struggle to do so. He swallowed hard and nodded. "Yes, I think so. A curse. Something like a curse." He paused. "No, not something like. That's bullshit equivocation. I think I've had a gypsy curse laid on me." "Come in," she said. She brought him the martini he'd asked for in an oversized glass. The martini was very strong, which Halleck did not mind at all. "He is in Minnesota," she said dully, sitting down with her own martini. It was, if anything, bigger than the one she had given to Billy. "But not visiting relatives. He's at the Mayo Clinic." "The Mayo?" "He's convinced it's cancer," she went on. "Mike Houston couldn't find anything wrong, and neither could the dermatologists he went to in the city, but he's still convinced it's cancer." She took frequent bird-like sips at her drink. Its level sank slowly but steadily. "Mike Houston gave him creams that didn't work, and the dermatologists gave him creams that didn't work, and then they gave him shots that didn't work. I was the one that remembered the old gypsy, the one with the half-eaten nose, and the way he came out of the crowd at the flea market in Raintree the weekend after your hearing, Billy. He put his hand on Carrie's face and said something." Halleck took a second gulp of his drink just as Lita set her glass empty on the table beside her. "He's convinced it's skin cancer because he can't let himself believe in anything as ridiculously old world, as superstitious, as penny dreadful novel as gypsy curses. But I saw something deep down in his eyes, Billy. I saw it a lot over the last month or so, especially at night, a little more clearly every night. I think that's one of the reasons he left, because he saw me seeing it." "Refill?" Billy shook his head numbly and watched her go to the bar and mix herself a fresh martini. "Lita, what's wrong with him? What happened?" Happened? Why, Billy, dear, I thought I'd told you, or that you knew somehow." On Sunday afternoon, the old gypsy man had touched Carrie's face. On Tuesday morning, the trouble had begun. After a shower, Carrie had come downstairs to the breakfast nook wearing only his bathrobe and had said, "Look at this." This turned out to be a patch of roughened skin just a little above his solar plexus. The skin was a shade lighter than the surrounding flesh. The rough patch looked yellowish to her, the way the calluses on the heels of her feet sometimes got in very dry weather. She had touched it. Her voice faltered momentarily here, and then drawn her finger away quickly. The texture was rough, almost pebbly, and surprisingly hard. Armored. That was the word that had risen unbidden in her mind. 2 nights later he had called her into the bathroom, his voice so like a scream that she had to come on the run. The patch of hard yellowish skin had spread upward to the area between his nipples and downward, widening toward his belly button. This changed flesh was raised above the normal flesh of his belly and stomach by almost 1/8 of an inch, and she saw there were deep cracks running through it. Several of them looked deep enough to slip the edge of a dime into. "What is it?" he nearly screamed at her. "Lita, what is it?" "I don't know," she said, forcing her voice to remain calm. "But you've got to see Michael Houston. That much is clear. Tomorrow, Carrie." A week later, Rossington had been seeing the best team of dermatologists in New York. They knew immediately what was wrong with him, they said, and a regimen of hard gamma X-rays had followed. The scaly flesh continued to creep and spread. The dermatologists told Carrie they had been a bit off course. "What do you mean?" Carrie asked. "You guys said you knew. You said you were sure." Well, they said, these things happen, but now we have it licked. All the tests, they said, bore this new conclusion out. A regimen of hypovites and glandular injections had followed. At the same time this new treatment was getting underway, the first scaly patches had begun to show up on Carrie's neck, the underside of his chin, and finally on his face. That was when the dermatologists finally admitted they were stumped. There had followed 2 weeks, Leda told Halleck, that she could barely bring herself to speak of. At the end, before he finally gave up and went to the Mayo Clinic, both of his hands were claws. His eyes were two bright little sparks of blue inside those pitted, scaly hollows. His nose, she grasped at his hand. Her eyes were great glittering pools of uncomprehending horror. "He looks like an alligator now," she said in what was almost an intimate whisper. "Yes, that's what he looks like, Billy. Like something that just crawled out of a swamp and put on human clothes. It's like he's turning into an alligator, and I was glad he went. Glad. I think if he hadn't gone, I would have gone, yes, just packed a bag and... She was leaning closer and closer, and Billy stood up suddenly, unable to stand any more of this. "Leda, I have to go." "Of course," she said. "Just came for the straight dope, didn't you, Billy dear?" "I'm sorry," he said. I'm sorry about everything that's happened. Please believe me." "Why, Billy? Why did you have to hit the old woman? Why did you have to bring this on Carrie and me? Why?" "Leda, come back in a couple of weeks," she said, still advancing as Billy groped madly behind him for the knob of the front door, holding on to his polite smile by a huge act of will. "Come back and let me have a look at you when you've lost another 40 or 50 pounds. I'll laugh and laugh and laugh." Halleck made it to the corner of Park Lane and Lantern Drive and then collapsed onto the bench inside the bus shelter, shivering as if with ague, his throat and stomach sour with acid indigestion, his head buzzing with gin. He thought, "I hit her and killed her, and now I'm losing weight and I can't stop. Carrie Rossington conducted the hearing. He let me off without so much as a tap on the wrist, and Carrie's in the Mayo Clinic. Who else was in on it? Who else was involved in a way that the old gypsy might have decided called for revenge?" He thought of the 2 cops rousting the gypsies when they came into town, when they had presumed to start doing their gypsy tricks on the town common. One of them had just been a spear carrier, of course, just a patrol car jockey following orders. Whose orders? Why, the police chief's orders, of course. Duncan Hopley's orders. Duncan Hopley? Hopley, maybe. A strong maybe, Billy amended. In one way, Hopley was just another species of trained dog whose most urgent directives were aimed at preserving Fairview's well-oiled status quo. But Billy doubted if the old gypsy man would be disposed to take such a bloodlessly sociological view of things, and not just because Hopley had rousted them so efficiently following the hearing. Rousting was one thing. They were used to that. Hopley's failure to investigate the accident which had taken the old woman's life. Ah, that was something else, wasn't it? I ought to go see Duncan Hopley. Not tonight. He'd had enough for tonight. The next morning, the scale registered 176.